Welcome back and Happy New Year. To kick off this year, I want to share with you a pet portrait I worked on over the holiday and talk about how I set myself up to create the best painting I could by using good reference, and how you can level up your reference game so that every painting you make is set up for success. So the very first thing I needed to have before I could get the right reference for this painting was to know my style and thus have a sense of what this painting should look like when it's finished. And this is what you need too. You need to know your goal for your work. I know, I sound like a broken record in these videos, but your goal for your work impacts the kind of reference you want. Some people love getting reference that has a photographic feel, like a Polaroid, and having certain camera lenses and cropping can really contribute to this. Other people want the work to look as though it was painted from life, even if you had to work off a photo. That will require very different cropping, and you'll probably want a camera lens that is meant to closely mimic how the human eye would perceive that subject at a distance. And this is only speaking to the bit about the actual photography, and doesn't even speak to things like the composition and things you would do to simply set up the shot. This might sound pretty obvious, but I find that it's really easy for us as artists to really get off course from this. Of course, by now, I have a pretty defined aesthetic when I sit down to make an oil painting. Just as an example of how easy it is to get off of your path, I was sitting down to do a sketch, just for fun, not, a capital F fine art piece, but just a personal piece for myself. And I got halfway through it and realized I was completely stuck. And when I went through and analyzed why that might have happened, I realized that at the end of the day, I had no idea what my finished piece was supposed to look like when I was working in this sketch format as opposed to my typical oil painting approach. But when I sat down and actually took a look at my inspiration for that kind of sketch, suddenly it was really clear what needed to happen for me to successfully take that little fun project all the way through till the end. And that's part of what we're going to talk about today for you. So for this piece, I wanted this painting to look like it was done from life, even though this was a gift and I had to be sneaky, which meant painting from life wasn't actually a possibility. I got to work figuring out what it meant that a portrait look as though it was painted from life and not a photo. And for this painting, here's what I came up with. I wanted the painting to feature a still pose that I'd be reasonably able to capture from life. By contrast, capturing this adorable border collie, her name is Lucy, by the way, if I wanted to capture her running, that would have been really tricky, and that's not something that you can easily do from life, so if I had painted her running, it probably would have had a photographic feel to it. Next, I wanted the color to be rich and not washed out. This is really common with photography. Oftentimes in photos, we just don't see color as vividly as we do in real life. And I wanted to avoid getting overly tight throughout the whole painting the way that cameras often encourage us to do, and instead focus details in just a couple of areas and let the rest of the painting feel loose and painterly. So with that in mind, I knew right away that I needed to take a photo myself. I've learned this the hard way from accepting a lot of commissions, but I will always be able to get a better reference myself when I have specific goals like these in mind for a painting. And here's why. When I take a photo myself, I can control the light, the pose, the composition, any props, you name it. And I need to do that in order to get the stillness and the color and the focus in the right places as per my goal for this piece. By contrast, it is highly unlikely that I would get all of those things from a photo that was handed to me, although occasionally it does happen. And occasionally, like with memorial portraits, it just isn't possible for me to take a photo myself. And in those cases, I only take on a project if I've been shown a photo reference that I know will capture the qualities I would need to make a great painting. This comes from time and experience, and I think one of the best ways you can figure out what's going to yield a successful painting for you is to really do the work we're talking about in this video and get clear on what really does and does not work for you. Then, when you're shown a reference, you can tell really quickly at a glance whether or not it will work. And the result, especially for commissions, is that both of you come away happier, even if it means suggesting a different path for your client, whether that might be with, a different kind of artist, or whether that might be working in black and white as opposed to color. Either way, when you get really clear on what you're going to be successful painting, you're going to have a better time painting, and you're going to really set client expectations effectively so that they're really excited by the end result as well. One more thing I want to touch on is a reference that was taken by a professional photographer. So occasionally you might actually get handed reference like this and wonder if that's good enough, to which I would say, maybe. Here's the thing. What makes a good moment that we'd capture on our iPhones, for instance, isn't the same thing as what a professional photographer would capture, which isn't the same thing as what a painter wants to capture. So here's what I mean. With our phones, we usually snap candids that don't necessarily have the most flattering angles or lighting or composition. Typically, when we take out our phones, we aren't thinking like a professional painter or a professional photographer. We simply want to be reminded of what it was like to be there in that moment. So holding on to these images is great, but it doesn't necessarily make for a striking painting. And this is distinct from what professional photographers will capture. They'll be intentional about composing the shot and getting the kind of lighting they want, but the standards of what makes a good photograph, especially a good portrait photograph, is quite different from what we're used to in painting. If you think about a typical headshot, photographers will often stage the shot in soft lighting to avoid harsh shadows that might unintentionally age the subject or feel a little bit dark by the standards of contemporary photography. Similarly, shots might be taken indoors in photography studios. There probably won't be a lot of color just naturally bouncing into the subject's skin tone. And even if there were, a camera isn't usually good at picking up on that color variation the way that our eyes are. So professionally shot photos, while beautiful, aren't necessarily what we're after as painters either, which leads us to the photos I took for this painting. So first up, I know people will ask about the equipment I used, so right off the bat, I will say that I used a Sony a6600 to shoot these photos with a prime 35mm portrait lens. And the prime lens I used because I knew I didn't need to take any of these shots from a distance and wanted something that was close to how the human eye would see our subject at the distance I intended to take these photos from. I'll link both the camera and the lens in the description. That being said, if you already have a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, that should be enough to get a really great shot. It might not be ideal if you're like a sports photographer or you want to photograph something that's really fast moving. For most of us and most portrait work, what you have is honestly great. As an example of that, for a lot of things, I love my iPhone. In fact, I suggest it for getting started filming YouTube videos. Although for these kinds of photos, I don't think I'd be able to get the shot I wanted with my iPhone. So this is one case where I do think it helps to have something beyond your smartphone's camera. But if you already have a nice camera, if you already have a DSLR or you already have something of that caliber, that is definitely enough. You don't need to run out and change out your camera. All right, and with that out of the way, here were the things that I thought about to get these photos. First was to get her whole body whenever possible. I can always crop in tighter, but I can't make up parts of her body that I accidentally left out. This really helps contribute to that sense of this being a painting versus a photograph. If you look at old paintings, it's very rare that objects would be just cropped off the side of the canvas, but it's a very common feature of contemporary photography. And I find that if I just go ahead and try and fit in the whole subject, it is much easier to make something look as though it was meant to be a painting and it was painted from life versus a photograph. Next, I needed to try to get angles that matched the portraits that I like the most. AKA, I need to take my photos at about her eye level. If I take the photos looking straight down at her from my height, the portrait won't have a feeling like it could have been done from life. It'll again have that kind of photographic feeling. My next note was to not be afraid to literally crawl around in the dirt to get that shot. In order to be at her eye level, I had to get low, which again is why I didn't use a tripod for this. That would have just gotten in the way, quite frankly. And there are a lot of shots where I was literally lying on the ground. Next, I would suggest having a friend to help you play with your subject, if that's an animal, or kind of entertain or focus your subject, if that's like a kid, for instance. And in this case, I had a friend helping me to maintain Lucy's attention and direct it in the right direction to get a flattering shot. She also was a really great just kind of like second voice affirming which compositions looked really, really strong. And then finally, my last note here is to try out all sorts of lighting. I wound up sticking with a shot of her outside in the overcast lighting, but I tried everything. I took photos in the barn, I took photos that had like backlighting, and when something wasn't working, I immediately tried something different. I didn't just stick to one setting and one light setup. Now, with that done, I went ahead and reviewed my photos. I knew none of them would be perfect. After all, I set my camera to auto to get these shots, but in Lightroom, I could up the vibrance, add a vignette, play with the exposure, and tweak all those little things to capture exactly what I wanted. And after I compared everything, I came away with my favorite photo. Only problem was, this is a shot of her full body. Now, I know, I said that was what I was shooting for, and I think that this whole composition would make for a beautiful painting. It was just too big for the 6x8 canvas that I had planned around using. So I had to crop in to get something that could fit comfortably on that 6x8 canvas without her features getting so small that they would be impossible to capture. This is something that I actually see trip painters up a lot. They often compose an image not taking into account how small the subject might become once it's fit into a small canvas. The other thing I see tripping painters up is not planning around the aspect ratio of their canvas. So they'll use a square image for a 6x8 composition like this one and have trouble fitting in all of the elements of that image, or find that the composition loses its flow when the aspect ratio isn't the same as what they had in their reference. So I made sure to crop this image to 6x8 to make sure I liked the design of it. And once that was done, it was time to take this and mock up the final reference that I would paint. For this, I tested a number of different backgrounds that created all sorts of value structures, color schemes, and flow of the eye across the canvas. To do this, I grabbed sections of paintings that could give me a sense of various paint and linen textures without actually including any detail from those paints. Next, once that was done, I threw out every mock-up that I wasn't really excited about, and finally selected the one that I thought would be the best fit. So no repainting or experimentation was necessary here. And this is one of the biggest factors I notice in how long a painting takes to finish. So if you're frustrated by how long your paintings are taking, I would start by taking a look at your workflow and ask yourself how much you're truly setting yourself up for success when you plan your reference and plan your painting. If this is something you'd like to have happen for every painting, that you are set up for success, this is what I love helping painters to do. When I work with an artist, we take a close look at your goals, the way you want to paint, and we work out a system that you can use to set yourself up for success, painting after painting, and take the guesswork out of that equation so that you can turn your vision into a body of work. If that sounds like what you've been needing, I'll include a link to book a call with me to see if we're a fit to work together, and that will be in the description. And until next time, happy painting.